Hello, class. So, welcome back to another session on hazard assessment. And today we'll be talking about how hazard as a term, as a phenomena, how it has evolved from one paradigm to another, how we as a scientist, as a disaster managers, how did the terminology of hazard change over time? How in the history have we observed hazard, how we have defined it, and we have then consequently changed the definitions of hazard over time. So uh, now disaster or a hazard specifically, it as the world population is growing, people are becoming more and more exposed to the hazard. And as people become more prosperous or developed, especially in the developed countries, their personal and wealth, or you can say prosperity, is at risk. So as urbanization is spreading, complexity is growing, expensive infrastructure is going to be needed in an city or a mega city. It is now also exposed and at a potential threat to large scale losses due to these hazards. And these trends or these hazard are basically uh, they are very much dependent on the high per capita level of human consumption we are doing, and we are burdening our environment through exploitation of land, forest, water, and that puts us into fear about environmental quality. Now these risks of modernizations in the developed countries are different, but the lesser, or you can say relatively less developed countries, those world population of those developing countries are basically already facing insecurities because of poverty and high dependence on the resource bases, and their all these livelihoods and lives are highly vulnerable to these natural forces and hazards. So both of our developed and developing countries, although having different capacities and vulnerabilities, they are at risk. So that like poses a question like uh, are we how are as a world, is our world becoming more dangerous? If so, what is the cause? And why are, even if the developed nations are vulnerable so to these natural hazards or natural processes, so how are we going to be looking at it? If as a developing country, if those people are facing destructions or damages, can we do something about it? Why do we as a poor countries, we are experiencing more losses, more deaths? So, but so the question arises: how do we understand hazard? So, hazard has understanding has changed of hazards and disasters throughout the history. And in earlier historical times, in the recorded history, we have observed that hazard has been there, and people were concerned about earthquakes, famines, and floods in the ancient civilizations. And earlier, it was kind of treated as an act of God and a divine punishment for moral misbehavior, rather than over exploitation or use of our earth. And generally, it encouraged the acceptance that disasters are basically external and unavoidable events. And but later on, eventually, people started understanding that more, or they organized themselves. They made some organized attempts to limit these damaging effects, and that led to some of the famous paradigms of hazard, which try to focus on how to understand and how to react, or how to reduce the hazard risks. So the first paradigms which which came was the engineering paradigm. So the engineering pyramid, it originated basically with the first river dams which were constructed in the Middle East civilizations over around 4,000 years ago, which tried to defend the buildings against uh, floods. And similarly, we've also observed that there have been buildings have been developed around 2,000 years back. People started buildings in such a way that would reduce the risks of hazards. So over time, people start uh, developing some kind of structural measures or responses to control or limit the destruction or the impacts of certain physical processes. Now, we gradually started shifting or relying on more advanced technologies. By the end of 19th century, new measures like weather forecasting or these early warning systems were available to be deployed. And this approach basically helped in making all the build structures sufficiently strong enough to withstand direct hazard confrontation. And it is uh, largely even undertaken by the science-based governments, and still it is very much important, and it is the still a part of our policy making. So by it around the period 1950, the main issues which this paradigm tried to answer was what are the physical causes for the magnitude and the frequency of natural hazard, and how can it be protected. And as the main response was to develop some kind of maybe weather forecasting systems or such structures which were resilient or resistant enough to defend against natural hazards, especially these hydrometeorological hazards. Now, this led to the second paradigm, which is called the behavior paradigm, in which this was basically linked to, or it is being attributed to Dr. Gilbert White. So he was an American geographer who saw that natural features are not basically only the physical phenomena. It should not be seen as only the physical phenomena, but we also need to observe what sort of characteristics are existing in the society, or how decisions are made by certain individuals to settle and develop in the hazard prone area. So he proposed a human aspect or social aspect to the hazard, that we should also try to understand why people are living in those hazard prone area. So this approach kind of led to the social aspect, or you can say it was the first uh, idea pointing out towards the concept of vulnerability. So he posed the question: so what are the characteristics of a society which makes them live in a hazard prone area, and why does it make we make it more why the society are at risk? So he proposed that hazard must not be only understood uh, from physical point of view, the physical or natural processes, but try to answer that why societies are interacting with the disaster. So it eventually kind of produced a blended approach whereby earth scientists will continue to investigate the natural events, and engineers continue to build the, you can say, the structures which were resilient enough to resist the direct disasters. And this hazard based viewpoint became widely accepted, and in North America the it based some very you can say influential studies which pointed out that society or the social aspect of disasters or hazard must not be ignored. Okay, then uh, again another conflict was between these two thought of you can say school of thoughts, in which some governments tried to favor the behavior paradigm, and to some extent we have seen that this favoring of towards engineering point of view to resist a disaster is often favored by the governments, because it is showing some kind of physical measure, something tangible, something observable, rather than the social aspect. But at that era which after Gilbert White pointed out, theories began to develop by the social scientist, how is disaster going to be impacting, or how it is going to impact a certain society. Okay, so at that time and during this time, a lot of governments or science was opting for a solution that would be like kind of a technical or a technological fix that would resolve the problem of disaster. But later on, it started, uh, s- uh, and it was very famous because of at that time hydrometeorological instruments were being developed in which we were going to be recording or forecasting or predicting floods or you can say rainfall. So at that time, a growing confidence was there that these instruments would help maybe one day help us in understanding the physical or natural processes. And but the social side was already there, albeit not being so much prioritized by the governments. So during the same era of 1950 to 1970, uh, the governments began to, in US, for example, they began to construct dams to restrict flood controls. But White argued that for proper floodplain management, we should also integrate the non-structural component, that is basically the social aspect, to the management, so we can better and reduce the risk in a better manner and save more lives. But he also uh, showed that he was also of the viewpoint that at that time, because constructing something physical would show some kind of order or something tangible which we can show the community that this we have done something tangible. So that kind of thing basically was favoring the engineering perspective. And eventually, like we talked about, uh, other scientists continued at that time. They continued to observe, and they're still doing it, investigating why these natural or extreme events they start occurring. Engineer at the same time they started building and controlling the most of the basically how to design a building in such a way to withstand damaging forces or external hazards, external threats. While social scientists at the same time they started uh, understanding how humans should adjust, how should they behave, how should they be prepared enough to have better disaster risk reduction uh, philosophies in their societies. So social scientists also started making up theories or testing some theories as well. Okay, the third paradigm after that, the third paradigm, like it is seen from 1970 to 1990, there was a issue that why the least developed countries they suffer severely due to natural hazards or disasters. Why do they are more severely impacted, and what are the historical or socioeconomic conditions or causes behind this situation? So that was termed as the paradigm, development paradigm. So it was a more of a radical alternative which says that the, the the disaster losses can only be reduced if they are more developed. So other social scientists believed that the disasters are arising because of the marginalization of the poor communities of extreme events. So all the development is skewed towards the developed countries, so the poor nations would feel the brunt of it. And eventually, people started suggesting what should we do? How do we uh, have proper equal development, or you can say uh, the level of development should be prioritized. So at that time, due to this new phenomena of millennium development goals, these were starting to appear in the international agendas to help the low income countries, low middle income countries to uh, develop faster, to be at the power of the developed countries. So that paradigm basically uh, emphasized that because of the socioeconomic condition of the poor countries and the vulnerabilities and the natural processes, because of these three things, hazard, vulnerability, and capacities, because of this the poor countries suffer the most. So eventually this is kind of linked to the modernization theory, in which uh, because of the inequality in existing in the world, They will always, the poor will be always at more risk. And they were like linked to some certain, you can say, outcomes of capitalism, that uh, because of this capitalistic society in the world, the poor will continue to feel more disaster impacts. Okay, that led to basically that how do we start to measure the vulnerability. So in the 70s to 90s, the concept of vulnerability, albeit given by the in the behavior paradigm, it started emerging, and the words of vulnerability started forming in the disasters. And key concepts like poverty were identified, that these are the key issues or causes behind the damages or impacts of disaster. And ultimately that linked to how are we going to do vulnerability analysis, how to do some kind of quantitative assessments or risk assessment that would help us identifying which part of the society are the most vulnerable. And eventually, because of this paradigm shift, because of inequality and vulnerability dynamics, humanitarian assistance became one of the key, uh, you can say, uh, part of disaster risk reduction, in which the developed countries, they started helping out the people who are the countries which have suffered the most losses. So, but although this is not a permanent solution, but at that time, it was in that paradigm state that hazard was being treated as uh, inequality, and the developed countries, they are morally bound to assist the people who cannot fight against the disasters. Now, eventually, the developed countries, because of their better economic development, they were able to withstand disasters better, and the poor countries or the underdeveloped, or you can say vulnerable countries, that began to form because of the unequal economic dependency, and which linked to the which pointed out the word of human vulnerability, where the poorest or the most disadvantaged people or marginalized people were the key concepts, or you can say key phenomena, which started being, or you can say which started explaining the impact of disasters. So eventually what happened that although in the 20th century these two camps were easily identifiable, like physical scientists or earth scientists, they continued with the help of engineers and meteorologists, the climatologists, that hazard and behavior, they are uh, technical solutions that can help in mitigating disaster risks. But at the same time, social scientists started, you can say, saying that because of the poor socio-economic and political systems and governance systems of this countries, of developing and developed countries, they are the key culprits behind the increasing disasters and inequality of impacts. So that led to another paradigm, the last one, the complexity paradigm. Now, uh, now this is now widely accepted that disasters are now, albeit let's say talking about hazard, vulnerability, or even capacities, it is now becoming complex. The There are so many factors, or you can say dimensions, sectors, or unforeseen impacts of disasters, especially in the urbanized world where a lot of problems are already existing in the mega cities. So identifying which areas will be more impacted, which people will be more impacted, that is becoming more and more complex. So what this paradigm or approach focused on? So firstly, it tried to capture what are the positive things or positive lessons we have learned from the paradigms of engineering paradigm, the behavioral paradigm, and development paradigm, and how do we apply it collectively to reduce disaster or the impacts of disaster. But Again, as we become modern and more complex or multi-layered emergencies start to take place, like for example droughts, armed conflicts, or insecurities. uh, Sometimes, often, uh, because of environmental degradation, water scarcity, there will be more conflicts and water food insecurity, and that will ultimately might lead to poverty and famine, and that might create some kind of economic and social, like economic shocks or economic crisis. So these complexities, because of different phenomena, are existing now. So the understanding hazard and true nature is becoming more and more complex. And it is this approach explains that hazard and disaster should not only be seen from physical point of view or social science. So to understand it perfectly, we have to deal with them simultaneously. Then linking the disaster is now a integral part of sustainable development. And for achieving sustainable development, we must see what the global environmental change is happening, and then we have to incorporate it into the our development agendas. Then again, at that human vulnerability, and as we the uh, paradigm expands, or the what in the previous paradigm, the key word of human vulnerability was coined, but this paradigm started understanding the complexities even behind vulnerability. That will how these vulnerability, they are varying over space and time, even within the same country, developed or developing countries. These There are so many different vulnerability variations in the country that it has become very complex to identify the most vulnerable people. Uh, and secondly, the complex paradigm advocates that we should try to understand DRR and apply a development agenda to a very rapidly changing world. So it is not a static term. DRR agenda must match with the development, which is basically dynamic in nature, and we should continuously change it according to the new data or the new studies or new understandings of the complexities behind hazard and disasters. And it is estimated that this will, because hazard and disaster are still being investigated, and we are still investigating the key causes behind it, and we're learning everything day, everything new, new as the science expands. So they say that we must diversify, and we must be open to change in the hazard. And because of this, DRR has become more multidisciplinary, and because there are some uncertainties that would make the future is very, you can say, unpredictable in case of hazards. So for that way, because there are so many uncertainties about hazard, where will it come, when it will come. So because of these things, evolution of hazard is still taking place, and they are not. They are this paradigm is adding more and more disciplines to it. That only not only the social science or the engineers or the climatologist, we have also to understand or incorporate the viewpoints of economists, sociologists, and other various profession that might be directly or indirectly impacted by these disasters. So it is the point is it has become more and more complex, and because of future disaster and how people and society will develop, what sort of new construction technologies, development patterns will the world adopt, what sort of transportations systems, what sort of like smart city concept is already out there, how will that impact disaster. So the development itself, the urban development itself, is continuously evolving. The technologies, the processes, the governance, the systems, these are continuously evolving. So future disasters are like, they can be increased in number of scale or in severity, and that would again be very difficult to measure, because our society or the urban areas or mega city is rapidly changing. And again, these mega scale systems, mega scale events, they can like cross, they will be cross boundary, they can be regional, and and that events might disrupt your socioeconomic systems. And lastly, the uh, climate change concept, which was not in the paradigm of all the previous three. In this paradigm, it is estimated because we are still understanding what are the potential. We have identified the potential impacts of climate change, but we are not certain how much will be the impact, how much and where will it be impacted. So that complexities and complication is already there. So as a whole, the discipline of this disaster reduction or hazard management, we can call it hazard paradigms, it is continuously evolving. So the complexities are already there, and we are still trying to understand more and more. So that is where we stand today. Thank you.